good. Okay, let me pull up Jeopardy. So we've got Kenyaz and Aiden playing for the first round of the semifinals. If you guys want to pop your mics on. Let me just get to that. All right. Okay, are you two ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Here we go.
False.
That is correct, Kenyaz. Okay, here we go.
It's to give a defendant the opportunity to go ahead and say that they're guilty.
What else comes with it?
A plea bargain also comes with the opportunity to become guilty, and for a lesser sentence. Like
yeah, just make sure that you
sentence.
understand that the plea bargain is both the guilty plea plus the sentence.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Guilty, innocent, or non-contest? Non-contest, right?
Close enough. Guilty,
Non-contest,
not guilty,
contest.
or no contest. Yes.
Yeah, no contest. Okay.
Okay.
False.
False, yeah.
Both correct on that one. All right.
A gag order.
Go ahead, Aiden.
No, I already won, so go ahead. It's fine.
Go ahead, bro. Okay, all right. Okay, a gag order is like you can't talk about what people that were sitting in court can't talk about it outside of the court or whatever that happened.
Yes, exactly. All right, Kenyaz is our winner. You guys both get a 5 out of 5 for playing. All right. Any questions before we start going over the sentencing lecture? All right, let me just pull this up. Okay. So this week we're going to talk about sentencing, and we are going to give sort of a brief overview of the different kinds of way that are sort of the history of sentencing in our country. And then the second half of this lecture, we're going to talk about the death penalty specifically. All right. So under an organized system of criminal justice, the sentencing is the imposition of a penalty on a person that has been convicted of a crime. So again, remember that means that they have gone to trial and been convicted, or they have pled guilty. So sentencing follows what is intended to be an impartial judicial proceeding during which criminal responsibility is ascertained. So most sentencing decisions are made by judges, but in some cases, specifically death penalty cases, juries are usually involved in the special sentencing phase of courtroom proceedings. So this will be the second part of the lecture that we're going to talk about. If you are in a death penalty state, if you're up for a death penalty trial, you get something that we refer to as a bifurcated trial. And that means there's two trials. One, the trial to determine if you are innocent or guilty. And the second trial is if you are found guilty, then you are having another jury trial to determine if you get LWOP, so that's life without the possibility of parole, or if you're getting the death penalty. But we're going to talk a whole lot more about that at the end of this lecture. But for the most part, the sentencing phase of the trial, that is the judge that determines what sort of sentence you get. So the sentencing decision is one of the most difficult decisions to be made by the judge or the jury. Not only does it affect the future of this defendant, and at times it is a life or death decision, but society looks to sentencing to achieve a diversity of goals, most of which are not compatible with one another. So whenever a criminal sentence is handed down, there's always one disappointed portion of society. You can't make everybody happy with one sentence. So traditional sentencing options have included things like imprisonment, fines, intermediate sanctions. So things like house arrest, electronic monitoring, probation is another sentence that can be handed down. And for very serious offenses, the death penalty. So limits on the ranges, or the range of options available for sentencing, is generally specified by law. So if you look at the criminal code for each state, or even the federal criminal code, it lists all the crimes, but right next to that crime, it says the range of options for a sentence. And it's where the judge has a little bit of discretion within that range. That's where they come. That's where the judge's discretion kind of comes in. So historically, those limits, or those ranges that are specified by law, have shifted as an understanding of crime and the goals of sentencing have changed. So centuries ago, for example, it was thought that crime was due to sin and suffering was the culprit's due. And so judges were expected to be really harsh. That's when we saw a lot of capital punishment for non-serious offenses, torture, painful physical penalties, like chopping off a hand for a thief. They were all the result of that view. But as you can see, societal values of the time period really largely reflect the types of punishments that are viewed as the norm. So we started to see this sort of shift away from corporal punishment when around the time of the American and French revolutions, we saw an emphasis on equality of punishments. Influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, offenders came to be seen as highly rational beings who intentionally and somewhat carefully chose their actions. So recent thinking about sentencing emphasized kind of the need to limit the offender's potential for future harm by separating them from society. We also still believe that offenders deserve to be punished, but we haven't abandoned the hope that they can be rehabilitated. So modern sentencing is influenced by about 5 goals. And these are the ones that, like I said, whatever sentence you focus on that is focused on these goals, they're not always compatible with one another. So for instance, one of the goals of sentencing in this era is retribution. So this is a call for punishment based on the need for vengeance. So this is something like a harsh punishment. So the Get Tough on Crime movement focused on retribution. So lengthy sentences, death penalty, that's a retribution, right? We want to see vengeance for what this person did.
So we like in the justice system, like one of the main like goals of like a judge is to seek retribution.
I'm just saying that modern sentencing is influenced by these 5 goals. So so sentencing, society looks to sentencing to satisfy sometimes several of these goals, sometimes just one of those goals. So especially if you see like, a really heinous murder, most people are calling for the death penalty or vengeance, right? We want to see vengeance for this. If you look at the Derek Chauvin trial, you see complete divide about this. Half the nation is seeking vengeance for what he did. The other half of the nation is thinking that he was just doing his job, right? So we really see modern sentencing influenced by these 5 goals. And that's why not all of these goals are compatible, which is why whenever a sentence is handed down, someone is upset. So retribution is definitely one of the goals that we see. Another goal that we are looking for is incapacitation. So we're trying to protect innocent members of society from this offender who might harm them if we don't prevent them from repeating their crimes. So if you're someone that's looking for incapacitation, you might be looking for a lengthy prison sentence You might also be looking for the death penalty because if you put this person to death, then you're protecting the rest of society. Or you could be happy with electronic monitoring. So some people are looking for deterrence. So what we're seeing here is we want to use this person as an example, right? So the threat, use this example and the threat of punishment to convince people that criminal activity is not worthwhile. So people that are looking for deterrence as a goal, they want a very harsh and public sentence. So others are looking for rehabilitation. So this is based on the premise that a criminal can be cured of their problems or their criminality and be returned to society. So we see a whole host of people looking for rehabilitation purposes because 90% of people that are sentenced to prison are coming home. So if we just focus on retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence, we're going to make this person so much worse and then send them back. So we see a lot of people that are looking for their sentence to rehabilitate them. So that's why we see a lot of things like drug courts or mental health courts or veterans treatment courts, right? Instead of sentencing them to a harsh term of incarceration, we give them treatment. Or when we see prison-based rehabilitation programs, right? So Lane looked at vocational and educational programs in prison for his paper. So that's a focus on rehabilitation. So we're trying to use this time while they're incarcerated to make them better.
So when you mean like influences, right? Are you saying that these are the objective of the judge or of the jury?
Both, or just the sentence in the abstract nature, right? So when society hears about the sentence that this person is getting, everybody's kind of looking for one of these goals to be satisfied.
Oh, okay, I got you.
So the last sentencing influence is restoration. So this is seeking to address the damage caused by the offender by making the victim and the community whole again. So sometimes if you see an offender having to do community service, right? So maybe somebody that vandalized a building has to clean up after themselves. Or restitution is sometimes a part of someone's sentence. So if they injured someone, paying for their medical bills, that would be a good example right there. So ideally, whenever a sentence is handed down, all 5 of these goals can be checked off, but that's unrealistic. As you can see, not all of these are compatible. So whatever you were looking for, if you're looking for just 1 or 2, it's unlikely that all of society is going to be happy by one sentence because we're all kind of looking for different goals from each sentence. All right, so now we're going to start talking about the different types of sentences in our nation. And we're just going to be kind of talking in a broad sense because this is just an intro course. If you take my corrections class, we talk about this in a lot more detail. So basically, we're going to talk about 2 different types of sentencing. There's indeterminate sentencing, and in the next slide, we are going to talk about structured sentencing. So indeterminate sentencing was the norm up until about the 1970s, 1980s, when we started to see a shift away from indeterminate sentencing. So let me explain the way that we used to do it. So during most of the early 20th century, rehabilitation was the big goal of sentencing, okay? So what we see here is, so kind of the easiest way to think about indeterminate sentencing is that the judge had a lot of discretion. So the law gave them a lot of discretion. So for instance, you might have one criminal offense where the lowest sentence could be 3 years of probation and the highest sentence is 10 years in prison. And the judge had the ability to choose anywhere between 3 years of probation and 10 years of prison. So that's one of the reasons why it was indeterminate, because when you set foot in that courtroom for your sentencing date, you had no idea what sentence you were going to get. The point here was for the judge to tailor the sentence to this individual offender with rehabilitation in mind. So if you ever heard a judge hand down a sentence that sounded like the defendant shall serve not less than 5 years and not more than 25 years, that is an indeterminate sentence. So the first reason it was indeterminate is because the judge had such a wide discretion to choose from. They could choose anything along there. They're supposed to look at the criminal's past as well as the severity of the crime that they committed and choose something within there that they think would serve them best. The next reason that it was indeterminate is that the judge would sentence them to a range of time. So they might say something like, we're sentencing you to 3 to 5 years in prison. So the first reason it was indeterminate is because you didn't have any idea what sentence you were going to get when you walked in the courtroom. The second reason it was indeterminate was because you didn't know exactly when you were getting out. So if they sentence you to 3 to 5 years, what that means is you have to serve at least 3 years, and then you go up in front of a parole board. And a parole board determines if you will serve the last 2 in the community. So they sentence you to 3 to 5. So you could serve anywhere from 3, 4 to 5 years in prison, or you could serve 3 years in prison and 2 years on parole in the community. Or you could serve 4 years in prison and 1 year of parole in the community, if that makes sense. So parole played a very big role in indeterminate sentencing. So the judge would sentence you to a range of time, and then at that minimum time, you would go up in front of the parole board and they would look at your behavior in prison. If you had been behaving yourself, if you hadn't gotten any disciplinary infractions and you got your GED while you were incarcerated and started mentoring younger inmates, you would be a perfect category for parole. If you joined a gang and stabbed 5 people and have, not participated in your own rehabilitation, you will be denied parole. So that is the gist of indeterminate sentencing. So this kind of fell out of favor, like I said, in the 1970s, early 1980s. Part of the reason it fell out of favor was because our nation was starting to get tough on crime. If you remember back to that very first lecture when I was talking about that pendulum swinging between due process and crime control, around the 1980s, that pendulum swung towards crime control and we got tough on crime. We did away with this indeterminate sentencing model. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But another reason that we wanted to get away from this was it had a lot to do with discrimination. So basically, there were calls for either intentional or unintentional discrimination. So if you think of the wide discretion that these judges had, some offenders were getting 3 months probation, where other offenders were getting 10 years in prison for committing the same crime. And it started to look a little discriminatory towards minorities and those of a lower socioeconomic status. So people were making the calls for racial disparities, that minorities were getting harsher sentences and that non-minorities and richer people were getting less harsh sentences. So some of them said it was intentional, some of them said it was unintentional. So if you think of the time in the 1970s too, that was right off the heels of the civil rights movement. So our nation was, looking for racial inequalities, right? And this was one of the things that they saw as a potential problem. All right, questions about indeterminate sentencing. The big things to take away from this is that it's indeterminate for 2 reasons. One, you don't know the sentence you're going to get when you step in the courtroom because the law gave such a wide variety of choices. 2, you didn't really know how long you were going to serve because the judge would give you a range and it was up to the parole board to determine when you got released. All right, let's talk about structured sentencing. So until the 1970s, all 50 states were using some form of indeterminate or partially indeterminate sentencing. So I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me say every state is a little bit different, but this sentencing is no different. Every state is a little bit different about how they do this. I just want to kind of give you the basics to understand the difference between indeterminate and structured sentencing. But some states were saying, you know, for these crimes, it was indeterminate sentencing. For these crimes, it was structured sentencing. Every time they change the law too, and I'll read you a little bit of, when we start talking about parole, I'm going to read you just an excerpt of the state law on parole, and you will see every time they change the laws, you know, you will see different differences reflected in sentencing. So the day you are sentenced, whatever the law is that day, that is the sentence you get. So burglary is one of the most common offenses that I see when I talk to offenders in prison. And I talked to a group of about 10 burglars like 2 years ago, and each of them was serving a wildly different sentence because they had been sentenced, you know, like within a 5-year period, and the law had changed 5 times within that 5-year period. So just know that sentencing is incredibly complicated. It differs by state, it differs by year, because every time they change the law and it affects the sentencing, that is the sentence that you get for that year. So we're just going to learn the basics between indeterminate and structured, and just know that it gets incredibly more complicated than that. So up until the 1970s, all 50 states used some form of indeterminate or partially indeterminate sentencing. But like I explained in the last slide, calls for equity and proportionality of sentencing, heightened by claims of racial disparity in the sentencing practices by some of the judges, led a lot of states to move towards greater control over their sentencing system. So basically they were saying the judges had way too much discretion. So the critics of the indeterminate sentencing model, the one we just discussed, called for the recognition of 3 fundamental sentencing principles. So this was the problem, the main 3 critiques of this indeterminate sentencing model. So the first one was proportionality. So what we're saying here is that the severity of the sanction should bear a direct relationship on the seriousness of the crime committed. And when the legislation allows for such a wide variety of sentencing options, like 3 months or 3 years of probation to 10 years in prison, that doesn't match one crime, right? So it's not proportional. So the next problem with indeterminate sentencing was equity. So this refers to the belief that similar crimes should be punished with the same degree of severity, regardless of the personal or social characteristics of that offender. So for instance, remember I was saying one crime could be punished with 3 years of probation versus 10 years in prison. We shouldn't be seeing one offender or 2 offenders convicted of the same crime, one of them getting 3 years probation, one getting 10 years in prison. That is the opposite of equity. So if you can also point to a pattern where minorities are the ones getting the harsher sentences compared to non-minorities, that's where equity becomes a real problem.
So this was mainly based off doing that rise in crime, or is this like still current today with this discrimination with sentencings because of like the wage gap or the wide variety of time that they can get sentenced?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah. So basically, are you relating this to current times as saying like now people are still being sort of discriminated against based on their economic like levels and their you know, and their skin color and whatnot? Or
Not necessarily. So during the indeterminate sentencing model, because there was such wide discretion, people were making these claims. But because of that problem, we moved to make sentencing more structured, which I'm going to explain right now. So I'm not saying that sentencing now is perfect. I'm saying it's a little bit better because some of the changes that we've made, but when we made some of these changes, we accidentally made other problems as well. So I'm sure that you've noticed that in the news, we're still talking about sentencing reform. Our nation just can't seem to get it right. You know, it's like we can't find a happy middle ground between indeterminate sentencing and structured sentencing. So they both have their pros and their cons. And the other thing you have to think about is even if the majority of our states made this move, not all of them did. So there are some states that still have wildly disproportionate sentencing schemes. So this equity principle, the idea that similar crimes need to be punished by similar punishments, has to be balanced against something that we call social debt, right? So this means that an offender's criminal history should be considered in their sentencing, right? So this is where they say the judges should have a little bit of discretion, right? So if you have one offender that has been convicted of burglary for the first time versus another offender that this is their 5th conviction of burglary, we should see some differences in those sentences, right? The person that's been convicted of burglary for the 5th time should get a harsher sentence than the one that was convicted of the first time burglary, right? So we understand that we should see some equity, right? So similar crimes should be punished in the same way, but this has to be balanced with social debt, right? The offenders that have been continuously committing the same crime should receive a harsher sentence than the first time offender, if that makes sense. So someone that has committed a lot of crimes has a higher social debt than a first-time offender, so they should be getting a harsher sentence. So a lot of people that critique the indeterminate sentence or that were proponents of the indeterminate sentencing model said, we're not being racist, we're not being elitist, it's that we're simply looking at social debt, right? So it happens to be that the minorities have a larger criminal record than those that are non-minorities, and that is why they are receiving a harsher sentence. There's a small problem with that argument, though. So minorities are more likely to be arrested by the police, meaning they are more likely to wind up in the criminal justice system with more convictions. So if you make the argument that, yes, it's just social debt, you could also make the argument that a minority is more likely to be, so like we discussed, this actually might have been my corrections class, but minorities and non-minorities sell and do drugs at the exact same rate, but, and there is all kinds of research that shows that, but if you look at the arrest and conviction rates, minorities are much more likely to be arrested and convicted. So people that try to make the social debt argument are often shot down because they say, yeah, it looks like it's not racist, but if you go to the source of the matter, it's that these white people have been doing the same amount of crimes as the minorities. It's just the minorities are more likely to get caught. So there's pros and there's cons to both of these arguments. So because of those critiques of indeterminate sentencing and because our nation was moving towards a more crime control model, beginning in the 1970s, a number of states addressed these concerns by developing a model of sentencing that they referred to as structured sentencing. So structured sentencing defines punishments rather than allowing for all that judicial discretion. So there are 3 types of structured sentencing, and it's up to the state to determine what type of structured sentencing they want, or even if they want structured sentencing. So a lot of states use structured sentencing for their adult model, but they'll use indeterminate sentencing for their juvenile justice system. So it's really just up to the states. So there are 3 ways that states have changed to structured sentencing. So the first one is determinate sentencing. So this requires that a convicted offender be sentenced to a fixed term that may be reduced by good time or gain time. So indeterminate would say you're serving 5 to 10 years, right? In this instance, what we would be saying is you are serving 10 years, okay? So you may have heard of the phrase truth in sentencing. This came right off the heels of the determinate sentencing model. So they didn't want to say you're serving 10 years no matter what, because if you do that, you take away the initiative to behave yourself in prison. So they wanted to allow for small amounts of time to be shaved off the end of your sentence. So we'll sentence you to 10 years. And truth in sentencing is the same thing as the 85% law, which means you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence. We don't use parole anymore, and each prison can determine how you shave off that last 15%. That's what we refer to as good time or gain time. So one prison or one state might say, if you get your GED, we'll shave off 60 days. If you go 2 months without a disciplinary infraction, we'll shave off another 60 days. So you can cut off the last 15% of your sentence depending on this. That's what we call good time or gain time. So it still incentivizes you to behave in prison and to participate in your own rehabilitation. But we are still making sure that you serve a huge chunk of your sentence. So if you're sentenced to 10 years, you're serving at least 8.5. If not, you'll max out and serve that 10. But we don't need parole anymore. So determinate sentencing can also be really good for people that are attempting to participate in a bunch of rehabilitation programs, because we know exactly when they're getting out of prison. Those in an indeterminate sentencing scheme may know that they're getting out either in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 years. So it's harder for them to plan the programs that they're going to participate in. So some states do determinate sentencing. So what that means is if you read their law, it'll say aggravated assault, 10 years in prison. So we completely take away the discretion of the judges. And then it's up to you how you behave in prison, if you serve 8.5 years, 9 years, or max out and serve your whole 10 years. So some states will use something that they refer to as sentencing guidelines. So these guidelines consist of recommended sentencing policies, and they take away a lot of the discretion of the judges. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. So it might say aggravated assault 8 to 10 years. And they're not required that the judges follow them. But basically it makes it a lot easier to see if one judge is continuously sentencing above or below the norm, and especially if a pattern arises. So they're voluntary. The sentencing guidelines are voluntary, but it takes away some of that discretion. And the law reads that it's, the sentencing, like I said, it would be like 8 to 10 years instead of like 3 months probation versus 10 years in prison. But if a judge is continuously going above or below for one specific type of offender, it's a lot easier to see a pattern here. So the last thing that we do for structured sentencing refers to presumptive sentencing guides. So basically what we see here is that this was not developed by the state legislature, like determinate sentencing and sentencing guidelines. A sentencing commission is created to develop basically a chart to help you figure out how to sentence an offender. And if you think back to the very first lecture, when I showed you that very complicated matrix, that's a presumptive sentencing guide. So you have the types of the crime along the side and the criminal history across the top, right? So you might have, 4 or 5 types of offenses fall into category A, right? So that might be several types of burglary. Then category B might be several types of assault. Category C might be several types of aggravated assault, right? Along one side. And then you have the criminal history across the top. So if you've committed 1 to 3 nonviolent offenses, you might be within the first row. If you've committed a couple of violent offenses, you might fall into a different one. So basically you find the crime along the side and the criminal history across the top, and you come into the middle and it tells you how much time this person should get. That's a presumptive sentencing guideline. It's highly structured. It's a quantitative scoring device, and this is not voluntary. The judges have to follow this.
What was a thing you called that? It was called the crime something that you can look at the sentences, like what you can get for certain crimes.
Are you talking about like the criminal code for the state?
The criminal code or state. Yeah, I was gonna look at it later. I was just curious what it was called.
Yeah. So these are not voluntary. If a judge does want to go away from what this presumptive sentencing guideline suggests, they have to provide a written rationale from deviating from it. So it's pretty rare that the judge is going to deviate from this. So if they do want to deviate and they have to provide that written rationale, they have to explain either the aggravating or mitigating circumstances. So an aggravating circumstance calls for a tougher sentence and would be things like especially heinous behavior, cruelty, injury to more than one person, maybe denying that they committed the crime, not cooperating with the police, right? So if the judge feels that this presumptive sentencing guideline does not give a sentence that is high enough, they need to list the aggravating factors why they're giving this person a sentence above what the presumptive guideline suggests. Now, if they want to give a sentence lower than what the presumptive guideline suggests, then they have to list mitigating circumstances. So these are things that call for a reduced criminal punishment. So it would be things like cooperating with investigating officers, feeling really bad about the plight of the victim, surrendering themselves, so on and so forth. A lot of times good character is considered a mitigating circumstance. So the most common of the structured sentencing in our nation for about 20 years has been presumptive. It's actually really hard to find the presumptive guidelines for your state. They kind of keep those close to the chest. If you read the criminal code, it will tell you like that you could serve anywhere from like 5 to 7 years. And it's that presumptive guideline that helps the judge determine, where within you get that. It's hard to find these presumptive guidelines because they keep changing them too. It's the Sentencing Commission that creates this, and they update them almost every year. So our state uses presumptive sentencing guidelines. If you look at the criminal code, it just lists the number. It won't actually show you that quantitative scoring device that they use. So I've got a link on the next slide for our crimes and offenses. Here, I'll show it to you really quickly. Might have to stop share. It's pulling it up. Come on. Oh, here it comes. All right, so this is what the South Carolina code looks like right here. So it's pretty complicated. This is what a lot of states look like right here. So it explains the classes right here. Let me find something that's pretty small. So for let's see, so this one right here. So this is assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. So if you are convicted of this, it has to be, if it's a class A felony, not more than 30 years, not more than 25 years, not more than 20 years, so on and so forth. So it's up to those guidelines that kind of bring the number in a little bit smaller. And you can see it's pretty complicated, but this is what every state looks like right here. But this is what our state looks like right here. Here are the violent crimes all the way down here with the code right here. And then you can see the numbers for each one as you go through. But every time we change the law, this changes right here. So that's kind of the easiest way to see the criminal code for your state. But as far as getting your hands on those presumptive sentencing guidelines, that's something that kind of keep close to the chest with the judges. All right, so we are going to stop here. And on Wednesday, we'll pick up with sentencing in South Carolina today, but I just wanted to quickly kind of show you what our guidelines look like. We have a sentencing, South Carolina Sentencing Guideline Commission, and they are the ones that update that presumptive sentencing guideline as well as that, that website that we were looking at. All right, questions? No questions? All right, sounds good. Hunter, I will try to track down your review, and Zanaya, get that in to Kenya's when you can. And keep me posted if you're having trouble, and I'll help you do that, okay? I will have your grades and your edited drafts in there, hopefully by the end of the day today, all right? See you guys on Wednesday.